She arrived in Pale Fork, Texas with nothing but a typewriting machine and a gray wool dress, and they called her plain. But the moment she sat down at the recorder's bench, her boots found a groove worn deep into the pine footrest below. The exact same groove her father's feet had made 9 years ago, before he vanished without a trace, a forged signature in a dusty ledger, a young man about to hang for a murder he didn't commit, and a woman who has spent her whole life writing other people's words, finally ready to write the truth. Stay right here because this story will show you that the most dangerous person in any courtroom isn't the judge. It's the one holding the pen. If it moves you, hit like, drop a comment, share it, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one.
The dust of Pale Fork did not settle. It merely waited for a different horse. Abigail Vance sat on the hard leather bench of the stagecoach, her fingers resting on the brass latches of the oak chest between her knees. It was 30 pounds of iron, levers, and ribbon, the only heavy thing she owned. To the driver who had hauled her from Austin, she was just a state employee with a dry cough and a gray wool dress that matched the late October sky. The ledger in the district office described her as steady and plain. They liked that word in Austin. Plain. It meant a woman who wouldn't swoon when the circuit docket turned to cattle rustling or blood on the saloon floor. It meant a clerk who would keep her eyes on the keys and her mouth shut. The coach groaned to a halt. The door swung open, letting in the sharp, bitter smell of roasted coffee, horse sweat, and red clay. "Miss Vance," a voice said. It wasn't the driver. The voice was low, gravelly, and carried the slow cadence of a man who spent days talking only to his horse. Abby looked down. A man stood in the dust, holding the carriage door back with one leather-gloved hand. He wore a faded wool coat, sewn at the cuffs, and a silver federal badge pinned flat against his left lapel. Iron gray hair showed beneath the brim of his Stetson. His eyes were the color of riverstone. Marshal Cole Sterling. He reached up to take her hand. His grip was wide and dry. When she stepped down, her boots sinking 2 inches into the dirt, she didn't offer a polite smile. She just took her chest from the driver's box herself. Cole reached for the handle of the wooden box, his brow furrowing slightly at the weight. "You travel heavy for a temporary clerk, ma'am." "The law doesn't come light, Marshal," Abby said. Her voice was flat, rhythmic, clipped at the edges. "The keys are iron. The paper is thick. If you want a town to stay straight, you have to carry the weight of its words." Cole looked at her then, really looked. He saw the high, severe collar of her gray dress, the hair pinned back until it pulled the skin at her temples, and the absolute stillness in her face. There was no lace on her sleeves, no ribbon in her hair, but there was an economy in her movements that didn't belong to a school teacher or a lonely spinster. "They told me you were plain," Cole said, his horse shifting behind him. "I am," Abby replied, her eyes fixing on the brick courthouse across the square. "Plain things don't warp in the sun." The county courthouse of Pale Fork was too clean. Abby sat at the oak recorder's bench in the corner of the courtroom, her machine set before her. The wood smelled of fresh beeswax, hiding the older scent of damp stone. On the wall behind the bench hung 3 different portraits of Judge Thaddeus Vance, same heavy jaw, same gold watch chain. 3 different angles, all looking down at the empty jury box. Thaddeus entered from his private chambers, his silk robe rustling like dry corn husks. He was an older man, 58, with silver hair trimmed close and a handshake that could break a colt. He smiled when he saw her, a warm, expansive expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Abigail," he said, spreading his hands. "My brother's girl. When the circuit told me they were sending a Vance to log the Pruitt trial, I thought it was a joke. This is no place for family. The circuit goes where the docket is full, Uncle Thaddeus," Abby said. Her fingers were already resting on the keys of her machine. Small, light taps. Clack, clack. Thaddeus leaned against the edge of her desk. He smelled of expensive rum and tobacco, things you couldn't buy within 80 miles of Pale Fork unless you owned the road they came on. This Jesse Pruitt business, Thaddeus said, dropping his voice to a confidential whisper. It's a sad affair. A boy from the camps. No family, no property. He doesn't understand the machinery of a town like this. We must keep the proceedings brief, Abigail, for the peace of the county. A long trial only breeds bad blood among the hands. Abby didn't look up from her keys. She watched the way his gold watch chain swung against his vest. A steady, artificial rhythm. A brief trial is a luxury for the judge's uncle, Abby said clearly, her voice carrying through the empty courtroom. But the law isn't a pair of boots you tailor to fit the comfort of the town. A poor man has the same right to a slow, tedious accounting of his life as a cattle baron. If we cut the words short to save time, we aren't keeping the peace. We're just burying the argument. Thaddeus' smile stiffened. His fingers tightened on the edge of her desk. You have your father's tongue, Abigail. Look where it got him. Left the jurisdiction with nothing but a carpetbag and a bad name. He left the record, Abby said. She shifted her feet beneath the desk. As she did, her boot found a deep, smooth indentation in the pine footrest below. It was a worn groove, angled slightly to the left, the exact mark her father used to wear into the wood of their kitchen table, when his left leg cramped from hours of writing. Elias Vance had sat here. He had sat in this exact chair 9 years ago. The sun was dropping below the timberline when Cole Sterling walked into the courtroom. The gallery was empty, the air heavy with afternoon heat. Abby was still at the bench, her fingers moving in short, rhythmic bursts over the paper ribbon. She wasn't looking at the keys. She was looking at the empty witness chair. Cole stopped by the door. He didn't come inside the bar. He stood where the public stood, his hand resting on the low wooden rail. The judge is at the hotel, Cole said. He eats at 5. The judge doesn't dictate the clock of the ledger, Abby said, without stopping. Clack, clack, thump. The words spoken this morning have to be filed before the sun goes down. That is the federal rule. Cole watched her hands. They were small, the skin red from the ink ribbon, but they moved without a single hesitation. You're looking for something, Miss Vance. Abby stopped. The silence in the room became absolute, save for the distant call of a crow outside. She turned her head, her gray eyes locking onto the silver badge on his chest. 9 years ago, a recorder named Elias Vance sat at this desk, she said. Her voice didn't shake. It was conversational, casual. The ledger says he left voluntarily on a Tuesday morning. But the left footrest under this desk is worn through to the secondary timber. A man doesn't wear down an inch of Texas pine in a 2-week circuit session. Marshall. Cole didn't move. His jaw tightened, the muscle working beneath his weathered skin. He looked at the floor between them. Some men stay longer than their names are on the ledger, Cole said softly. And some men look at a badge and forget who gave it to them, Abby replied. She stood up, her gray skirt falling flat around her boots. She didn't look plain anymore. She looked like the iron rods inside her chest. My father didn't leave this town through the front door of the stagecoach, Marshal Sterling. And you were the deputy who held the horses. Cole took a slow, heavy breath. He didn't deny it. He didn't reach for his hat or turn away. He just stood at the rail, looking at the woman who had come to write down the things Pale Fork had spent 9 years trying to forget. The trial starts at 9 tomorrow, Cole said. I'll be here at 8, Abby said. Make sure the ink is fresh. The pine boards of the gallery did not groan under the weight of the townspeople. They screamed. By 8:30 in the morning, Every bench in the Pale Fork courtroom was packed shoulder to shoulder with men who smelled of horse liniment and raw tallow. They were cattle hands from the Western Line, merchants from the square, and homesteaders who had driven 10 miles through the red dust just to see a man fight for his neck. They didn't come for the law. They came for the spectacle. Abigail Vance sat at her small oak desk, her fingers poised over the cold iron keys of her machine. She did not look at the gallery. She did not look at the windows where the dry Texas wind rattled the glass. She looked at her paper ribbon. To her left, behind the heavy cedar railing, sat Jesse Pruitt. He was 24, but his hands looked 40. They were scarred from barbed wire and stained with the dark, indelible grease of cattle dip. He wore a canvas shirt that had been washed so many times the blue had turned the color of milk. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at the men who wanted to see him hang. He stared at the small circle of sunlight on the floor, between his boots. Marshal Cole Sterling stood by the heavy double doors at the back. His hand was not on his revolver. It was tucked into his belt, right beside his badge. His eyes moved over the crowd like a man watching a herd before a lightning strike. Every time a boot scraped or a man cleared his throat, Cole's chin lifted half an inch. He was counting. He was weighing. At exactly 9, the door to the judge's chambers clicked. "All rise," the bailiff barked. The crowd stood, a great, collective rustle of wool and leather. Thaddeus Vance walked in, his silk robe catching the morning light as he climbed the 3 steps to the high bench. He didn't look like a man about to try a murder. He looked like a governor arriving at a banquet. He adjusted his gold spectacles, cleared his throat, and looked down at Jesse Pruitt. "The state of Texas versus Jesse Pruitt," Thaddeus read. His voice was a rich, beautiful baritone that filled the rafters. "The charge is murder in the 1st degree. The victim is Samuel Hogue. How does the accused plead?" Jesse didn't move. He didn't understand the cadence of the room. He looked at the floor, then at his attorney, a young, sweaty man named Miller, whom the state paid $10 a week to lose cases. "Not guilty, Your Honor," Miller said, his voice cracking like dry kindling. The trial began with a flourish of words. The prosecutor, a man with grease on his lapels and silver in his hair, stood before the jury box. He talked about the sanctity of property. He talked about the blood of a pioneer crying out from the dirt. He used words like premeditation and malice aforethought, dropping them into the room like heavy stones. Abby S. fingers moved. Clack, clack, thump. She did not write the emotion. She wrote the nouns. She wrote the verbs. When the prosecutor sat down, the first witness was called. It was a foreman from the Hogue Ranch, a man named Silas Horn, whose knuckles were perpetually swollen from rope burns. He took the Bible, kissed the leather with a wet smack, and sat in the high chair. "Tell the court what happened on the night of October 12th, Mr. Horn," the prosecutor said. Horn leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. Jess was in the bunkhouse. He was sour. He'd been sour for 3 months because Mr. Hogue hadn't paid the hands their seasonal bonus. Jesse stood up and said he was going to the main house to get what was his. He had his skinning knife in his belt. I saw it. Abby's fingers flew. Clack, clack. Miller stood up to cross-examine. He was trembling. "Mr. Horn, did Jesse say he was going to kill Mr. Hogue? Or did he just say he was going to ask for his wages?" Before Horn could answer, Thaddeus Vance leaned over his high desk. His shadow fell directly across the witness stand. "The question is speculative, Mr. Miller," Thaddeus said, his voice smooth as grease. "The witness cannot testify to the intent inside the defendant's mind. He can only testify to the knife. We must maintain the boundaries of material evidence." "Proceed, Mr. Horn." with what you observed, not what Mr. Miller wishes you to surmise. Miller sat down. He didn't object. He didn't know how. Abby stopped her fingers for a fraction of a second. She didn't look at her uncle, but she recorded the pause in her ledger with a double strike of the space bar. 2 blank spaces. A silence imposed by the bench. Jesse Pruitt looked up then. His eyes found Abby's face. They weren't the eyes of a killer. They were the eyes of a horse that had been run into a box canyon and could see the ropes coming. During the noon recess, the crowd emptied into the square to buy cold beef sandwiches from the wagon. Abby stayed at her desk. She was threading a fresh ink ribbon into the iron spools, her fingers stained black to the second knuckle. Cole Sterling walked down the aisle. He didn't stop until he was standing right over her machine. "You didn't write down what Miller tried to ask," Cole said. Abby wiped her thumb on a scrap of rag. "The judge ruled it out of order, Marshal. If it says out of order, it doesn't exist on the official record. That is how they clean the ledger before the state looks at it." She looked up at him, her gray eyes reflecting the pale light from the window. "That is the first lesson of the law, Marshal," Abby said, her voice dropping into that rhythmic, conversational cadence. "The court doesn't always use the law to find the truth. Sometimes it uses the law to narrow the road so small that only one man can walk down it. If you control the definitions of the words, you control the man who is standing in the box. Thaddeus isn't trying Jesse for what he did. He's trying him for what he's allowed to say." Cole looked at her blackened fingers. "And what about what isn't allowed?" "That's what the private ledger is for," Abby said. She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound book with a brass clasp. It wasn't state property. It belonged to her. She opened it to the first page. In her clean, sharp shorthand, she had written, "Judge Vance intervened 3 times during the cross-examination of Silas Horn. Each intervention occurred when the defense questioned the financial records of the Hogue Ranch." Cole looked at the book. His hand moved to his badge, his thumb rubbing the silver edge until it shone. "A man who keeps 2 books is usually a thief, Miss Vance," Cole said. "Or a surveyor," Abby replied, closing the clasp with a sharp click. "A surveyor needs 2 points to find a straight line. The bench gives me the first one. I have to find the second one myself." A movement by the back door caught her eye. Bertie Cross was standing there. She had a bucket of fresh water in one hand and a tin dipper in the other. Her hair was tangled, her boots caked with dry river mud, but she wasn't looking at the court. She was looking at Jesse's empty chair. Abby stood up from her bench. Her gray dress didn't rustle. It was too heavy for that. She walked over to the rail where the girl stood. "You were there that night, weren't you, Bertie?" Abby asked. Bertie looked at the water in her bucket. Mr. Hogue was a loud man when he had the bottle in him. He liked to stand on the porch and holler at the stars. Jesse didn't touch him. He wasn't even within 20 yards of the porch when the timber gave way. "Did you tell the marshal that?" Abby asked, her eyes moving to Cole. "I told the judge," Bertie said, her voice dropping until it was barely louder than the wind outside. "He told me that a girl who doesn't know her letters shouldn't be giving testimony in a capital case. He said the law requires an understanding of an oath, and an oath is a written thing." Abby felt a cold, hard knot form in her stomach. She turned her head slowly to look at Cole Sterling. "An oath isn't ink, Marshal," Abby said, her voice rising just enough to reach his ears. "An oath is the truth told by a living soul. When a judge tells a child her eyes don't count because she can't read his books, he isn't protecting the court. He's treading on her human right to be a witness to her own life. A person doesn't need to know how to spell justice to know when a man is being pushed into a hole. Cole didn't answer. He turned his back to the courtroom and looked out the glass doors toward the square. His shoulders were straight, but his hands were clenched into fists inside his pockets. The bell in the church tower began to ring for the afternoon session. The gallery was already filling up again, the boots scraping the pine boards like 100 small saws. Abby walked back to her desk. She sat down, adjusted her paper ribbon, and waited for her uncle to return to his throne. The basement of the Pale Fork Courthouse did not have windows. It had mice, lime wash that was flaking off the stone walls like dried skin, and 30 years of paper that had turned the color of tobacco juice. Abby Vance stood in the corner of the room. At midnight, a greasy tallow candle stuck to the top of an empty lard tub. The air was thick with the smell of vinegar and rotting leather, the specific smell of state records that had been kept in the damp for too long. She had been down here for 3 hours. Her gray dress was white with dust at the knees, where she had knelt to drag out the old wooden crates from beneath the shelving. Her Uncle Thaddeus thought she was sleeping at the boarding house. Cole Sterling thought she was done for the day. They were both wrong. She opened a flat ledger with cardboard covers. The label on the front read, County Personnel, 1868 to 1874. Her fingers turned the pages slowly. The paper was brittle, cracking at the edges like autumn leaves. She was looking for a name she knew better than her own. On page 42, she found it. Elias Vance. Appointed Circuit Recorder for the 4th District, June 10, 1872. Abby held the candle closer. The grease dripped onto the stone floor with a tiny hissing sound. Beneath his name, in the neat official handwriting of the county clerk, was the final entry. Discharged from duty, September 28, 1872. Left the jurisdiction voluntarily due to failure of health and family obligations in the East. Beneath that statement was a line for the recorder's signature. A validation of the departure. Elias Vance. Abby didn't breathe. She didn't move the candle. She reached out with her left hand and touched the ink. It was faded to a dull brown, but the shape of the letters was wrong. Her father had been a left-handed man in a state that beat children for using the wrong hand. He had learned to write with his right hand when the inspectors were in the schoolhouse, but he always left a sign. When he wrote his name, the capital V always started from the bottom and went up, leaving a tiny, blunt hook where the pen first touched the paper. It was a physical habit he could not break. The V on this page started from the top. It was smooth. It was elegant. It was written by a man who had never had his knuckles broken by a hickory ruler. The signature was a forgery. Abby turned the page. The next section was the court docket for that same week in September 1872. A vagrancy case. A horse theft. And then the ledger stopped. 3 pages had been cleanly excised from the binding. Not torn out by an angry hand. They had been cut with a razor close to the thread. Only a silver sliver of paper remained in the seam, showing where the steel had traveled. "You're going to burn that book if you hold the light that close," a voice said from the stairs. Abby didn't jump. She didn't close the ledger. She simply turned her head until she could see Cole Sterling standing on the 3rd step from the bottom. He didn't have his lantern with him. He had followed the smell of her tallow candle through the dark. "My father didn't sign this book, Marshal," Abby said. Her voice was too quiet for the basement, but it hit the stone walls and came back hard. Cole came down the last 2 steps. His boots didn't make a sound on the dirt floor. He was wearing his thin-soled riding boots, the ones he used when he didn't want the horses to hear him coming. He stood behind her shoulder, his coat smelling of the cold night air outside. He looked at the page. He looked at the cut binding. The judge wrote that name, Cole said. His voice was flat. No surprise, no anger, just the statement of an old debt. Abby turned around to face him. She was small between the high shelves of old paper, but she didn't look up at him. She looked straight into the silver star pinned to his breast. "You knew," she said. "I knew he didn't go back to Philadelphia," Cole said. He looked at the flaking lime on the wall. 9 years is a long time to keep a signature in a dark room, Miss Vance, Cole said, his words coming with those short, deliberate pauses. I was 32 then. I wore a Deputy S-Star that was smaller than this one. Elias came to my house on a Friday night. He had those 3 pages you're missing tucked inside his coat. He told me that Thaddeus was using the vagrancy laws to lock up every Mexican homesteader along the creek until their land claims lapsed for non-payment of taxes. He had the names. He had the dates. Cole stopped. He rubbed his face with his leather glove, the sound rough against his gray stubble. "And you told him to wait," Abby said. "I told him we needed a grand jury from Austin," Cole said. "I told him a county judge has roots that go down into the water table. If you pull on them too hard before the fruit is ripe, the whole tree falls on your head." I told him to stay in his room at the hotel until Monday morning. And on Monday morning he was gone, Abby said. "The judge told the town he left on the Sunday stage," Cole said. "He showed me that ledger. He showed me that signature. I knew Elias S., and I'd seen him write 100 dockets. I knew it wasn't his. But I looked at Thaddeus, and Thaddeus looked at me, and he told me that a town without a judge is just a camp with a fence around it. He said we needed the peace more than we needed the clerk." Abby reached out and closed the heavy cardboard ledger. The dust rose up between them, white and fine in the candlelight. "That is where the rot starts, Marshal," Abby said, her voice dropping, until it was almost a whisper, though every word was cut clean. "When you decide that one honest man is too expensive for the comfort of the county, you think you're saving the town, but you're just teaching the judge how much weight he can put on the rope before it breaks. Every time you let a forged name stand for the sake of peace, you're telling every poor soul in this valley that their name doesn't belong to them either. You didn't protect Pale Fork, Cole Sterling. You just built a stronger wall around Thaddeus Vance." Cole didn't move. He stood there in the dark basement, his shadow thrown huge against the stones behind him by her single candle. "He's your uncle," Cole said finally. "He's a man with a pen and an iron gavel," Abby said, picking up her candle. "My father taught me that blood is just what keeps the heart beating. It doesn't tell the hand what to write. The record is my family now, Marshal. And the record doesn't have an uncle." She walked past him toward the wooden stairs, her boots clicking sharply on each riser. She didn't look back to see if he was following her. She knew he was. A man who has lived with a forged signature for 9 years doesn't stay in the dark when the lamp starts to move. When she reached the top of the stairs, the cool air of the courthouse corridor hit her face. The building was empty, the high ceilings dark as a pine grove at night. She looked out the glass doors toward the square, where the lamp on the marshal's office was the only light left burning in Pale Fork. "The Jesse Pruitt trial ends on Friday," Cole said from the shadows behind her. "Then we have 3 days to find where the rest of the book went," Abby said. She adjusted her shawl over her steady, plain shoulders. "Because on Friday afternoon I have to sign the execution warrant if the jury brings in a guilty verdict. And I won't write my name under a lie. Not for Thaddeus Vance, and not for you." The kerosene in the marshal's office did not burn clean. It smelled of sulfur and old tallow throwing a yellow, greasy light across the county maps on the wall. Cole Sterling sat at his pine desk, his boots hooked behind the iron legs of his chair. He had his badge off. He held it in his palm, his thumb tracing the 5 points of the silver star until the metal grew warm from his skin. On the desk lay an old wool scarf, 3 spent .44 cartridges, and a small key that didn't fit any lock in the courthouse. He didn't sleep. A man who spends 9 years guarding an open grave doesn't find much use for the dark. Every time the wind hit the tin roof of the livery stable across the alley, Cole heard Elias Vance's voice. Not the voice of the old man he had found 3 years ago in the East Timber, but the crisp, precise accent of the city clerk who had walked into this very room in September of 1872. Elias had been wearing a black broadcloth coat that had never seen a Texas burr. He had been carrying 3 sheets of paper, like they were the stone tablets from the mountain. "They re-moving the stakes, deputy," Elias had told him. "They re-changing the descriptions in the survey books while the homesteaders are out on the range." Cole had been 32. His boots had been new. He had looked at the sheets of paper, then out the window at the 300 people who called Pale Fork home. He had seen the church they were building. He had seen the schoolhouse. He had seen the peace, and he had chosen the fence instead of the gate. The door to the office didn't rattle. It simply clicked, the latch slipping back into the iron housing with a smooth, oiled sound. Abigail Vance walked in. She didn't have her shawl on. Her gray dress was dark with the damp of the midnight mist, her hair still pinned into that tight, severe knot at the back of her neck. She carried her canvas satchel over her forearm like a ledger clerk, coming to take an inventory of a failed dry goods store. She didn't ask to sit. She walked to the small iron stove in the corner, looked at the cold ashes inside, and then turned her gray eyes to Cole's hand. "You take it off at night," she said. Her voice was thin, even, flat as a prairie road. Cole looked down at the badge in his palm. "The metal gets cold against the wool. It keeps me awake." "The metal doesn't have a pulse, Marshal," Abby said, walking closer until her skirt brushed the edge of his desk. "The weight isn't in the silver. It's us in the man who pinned it on. My father thought that star was a contract between the United States government and the dirt under your feet. He didn't know you had a sliding scale for the terms." Cole didn't put the badge back on. He laid it flat on the desk between them, the points facing the county map. "I had 40 men in this valley who couldn't read a brand, Miss Vance," Cole said. His words came slow, measured, separated by long gaps where his chest rose and fell. "They had 3 cows and 5 acres of corn apiece. If I told them the judge was a thief, they wouldn't have gone to Austin for a lawyer. They would have gone to the barn for a rope. Half of them would have been dead before the circuit court." Clerk could find the county line on his map. He leaned forward, his elbows on the desk, his face inches from her canvas satchel. "That is what the books don't teach you in Philadelphia," Cole said, his voice dropping into that quiet, rhythmic gravel. "The first right a man has in a new territory isn't the right to a ballot or a fair wage. It's the right to wake up in the morning and find his roof still over his head." I didn't hide Thaddeus's ledger because I loved his politics. I hid it because a bad law will only cost a man his land, but no law at all will cost him his skin. I gave the town 9 years to grow enough bark to cover the scar. Abby reached into her satchel. She didn't pull out her private shorthand book. She pulled out an old iron-rimmed pair of spectacles, the ones her father used when the ink ribbon was thin. She laid them beside his badge. "The bark is rotten, Cole Sterling," Abby said. She didn't look at the badge. She looked at the maps behind him. When you subvert the process of the court to save the peace, you aren't building a town, she said, her voice rising just enough to hit the tin ceiling. You're just building a bigger gallows. Jesse Pruitt is standing on the trapdoor right now because he knows what happened to the last man who tried to read your survey. Books. If you let Thaddeus hang him to keep the valley quiet, your peace isn't an achievement. It's as a conspiracy. A human being has a right to his life, Marshal, even if his death would make your ledger balance perfectly. Cole reached out and touched the iron frame of the spectacles. They were cold. He remembered Elias sitting by the window in the line shack, using a piece of charcoal to write Greek verbs on the back of dried lard sacks. He didn't want you to come here, Cole said. Abby's hand stayed on the strap of her satchel. He didn't tell me where he was going. He told me to let you think he was dead, Cole said. The silence that followed was different from the silence in the courthouse basement. It was the silence of a house after the clock stops ticking. Abby didn't move away from the desk. Her chin lifted, her nostrils flaring slightly as she took in the smell of the sulfur smoke. He was ashamed, she said. It wasn't a question. A man who has been a clerk for 20 years doesn't know how to live without his name, Cole said. He told me that if you found him in that shack, you wouldn't see the man who taught you the dockets. You'd see the man who let Thaddeus Vance take his inkstone away. He thought the lie was a kinder thing to leave you than his face. Abby turned toward the door. Her boots made a short, sharp sound on the threshold. She didn't look back at the badge or the spectacles on the desk. The lie belongs to you, Marshal, she said from the dark of the doorway. My father only borrowed it because he was tired. Settle your own account with the judge before 9 tomorrow. Because when I sit down at that bench, I'm going to write every word Jesse Pruitt says, whether it fits your piece or not. The door closed. The yellow light from the kerosene lamp flickered once, then settled back over the 5 points of the silver star. The cell beneath the Pale Fork livery stable did not have a lock that used a key. It had a heavy iron bar that dropped into 2 notched cedar posts. The metal pitted with rust from the dampness of the horse troughs above. Abby Vance sat on a 3-legged stool, 3 feet from the iron bars. She had her wooden steno box on her knees, the lid raised, the white paper ribbon feeding through the brass rollers like a thin, clean tongue. She didn't have her pencil in her hand. She had her fingers on the bone keys, her wrists held high and steady, exactly the way her father had taught her in the parlor in Philadelphia. Jesse Pruitt sat on the dirt floor, his back against the limestone wall of the foundation. He had a tin cup of black coffee between his knees, but he hadn't touched it. The grease from the mutton stew they had given him for supper had dried in the corners of his mouth. Cole Sterling stood by the ladder that led up to the livery floor. He had his rifle across his arm, the breech open, his eyes fixed on the square of light at the top of the rungs. He was the only guard the county had provided. He was the only guard Jesse had left. They're going to bring the jury back by 3 tomorrow, Jesse said. His voice was thin, dry, scraping against the quiet of the cellar like sand on a tin plate. The jury doesn't have the final word, Mr. Pruitt, Abby said. Her fingers made a soft, muffled sound against the keys. Tack, tack. The record goes to the district judge in San Antonio before the warrant can be signed. Every syllable you speak into this room is part of that file. Jesse let out a short, wet laugh. He didn't look at her. He looked at the rust on his tin cup. The district judge don't know my name from a steer's brand, ma'am, Jesse said. He'll look at the judge's signature, and he'll look at your neat little lines, and he'll say the county had a fair session. That is what the law is for people like me. It has just a long piece of string they use to measure the drop. Abby stopped her hands. She let her wrists drop until they rested on the cedar frame of her box. "The law isn't the judge, Jesse," she said. Her voice had lost that clipped, official tone. It sounded like a woman speaking across a kitchen table in the winter. "The law is an agreement between men that we won't use our knives every time we disagree about the boundary line," Abby said, her fingers tightening on the wooden lid. "It belongs to the man who can't read just as much as it belongs to the man who owns the printing press. If Thaddeus Vance uses the words to hide what happened to Samuel Hogue, he isn't breaking the prisoner. He is breaking the contract that keeps the whole state from turning into a slaughterhouse. You have a right to put your version into the ink, Jesse, even if they don't read it until after you're gone." Jesse looked up then. His eyes were wide, the white parts yellowed from the smoke of the cellar lamp. He looked at Cole Sterling's back, then at the white paper ribbon between Abby's hands. "I didn't go to Hogue's house for the money," Jesse said. Cole didn't turn around, but the rifle on his arm shifted half an inch. The barrel caught the yellow light from the lamp. "Tell her what you went for, Jesse," Cole said from the ladder. "I went for the book," Jesse said. He leaned his head back against the stone, his eyes closing as he spoke. "Samuel Hogue wasn't a bad man when he was sober," Jesse said, his voice dropping into that rhythmic, conversational drone of the frontier. "But he had a ledger in his desk with a green oilskin cover. He bought it from an itinerant trader back in '73. In the back of that book, he had the original survey marks for the creek timber, the ones old man Elias Vance drew before the county line was shifted. Hogue told me that if the railroad came through the valley, those 3 pages would be worth $5,000 in gold to the man who owned the water rights," he said. Thaddeus Vance had offered him $300 to burn the book. Jesse opened his eyes and looked at Abby's machine. Her fingers hadn't moved. She was listening with her whole face, her breath coming short and sharp through her teeth. "I was under the porch when Hogue fell," Jesse said. "He was drunk on that Jamaica rum. The judge sent him. He came out to the railing to holler at his hounds, and the timber just gave way. I heard the wood cracks. It sounded like a pistol shot. When I crawled out, he was lying in the ditch with his neck turned around. I didn't have no knife out. I went into the sitting room to get that green ledger before the foreman could find it." "Where is it now?" Abby asked. "I gave it to Bertie," Jesse said. "She can't read the figures, but she knows what a green cover looks like. I told her to bury it under the old blacksmith's trough behind the courthouse." Cole Sterling turned around then. He didn't look at Jesse. He looked at Abby. His face looked older than 41. The Nepnhan around his eyes looked like they had been cut into the sandstone with a chisel. "The blacksmith's trough was torn out 2 years ago when they put in the new well," Cole said. Abby stood up, her steno box held against her ribs like a child. Her gray dress looked dark, almost black, in the shadows of the cellar corners. "Thaddeus put the well in himself," she said. "He did," Cole replied. Abby walked to the iron bars, her face so close to the rust she could smell the old scale. She looked at Jesse Pruitt, then at the U.S. Marshal, who had guarded the secrets of Pale Fork for 9 years. "He didn't burn it," Abby said. Her voice was steady, but it had the ring of an iron shoe hitting a stone. "A man like Thaddeus, Vance doesn't burn a title book. He keeps it in his safe so he can look at it when he thinks about how much he owns. The record is still in his house, Marshal." Cole looked at the ladder, then at the 5-pointed star lying on his desk across the square. He could hear the first horses moving in the livery stable above the morning teams coming in for the trial. "The trial starts in 3 hours," Cole said. Then you better go get your horse, Abby said, because before the sun hits the cedar post on that gallows, we're going to open that safe. The mahogany desk in Judge Thaddeus Vance's private study did not belong in Texas. It had traveled by steamship from New Orleans to Galveston, then by ox cart through 300 miles of black mud to Pale Fork. It was heavy, dark, and smelled of the wax they used in places where men didn't have dirt under their fingernails. Cole Sterling stood by the tall glass window of the study. The sun was just clearing the tops of the post oaks to the east, throwing long orange bars of light across the oriental rug. Outside, the town was waking up. He could hear the iron tires of a freight wagon grinding against the river gravel in the square. Thaddeus sat in his high-backed leather chair, his silver hair brushed back until it shone like a new coin. He wasn't wearing his silk judicial robe yet. He wore a white linen shirt, a black silk vest, and a gold watch chain that dangled across his stomach. He was pouring black coffee from a silver pot into 2 china cups. "You look tired, Cole," Thaddeus said. His voice was that beautiful Sunday morning baritone. Warm, steady. A man, 40 years old, shouldn't spend his nights sitting on a 3-legged stool in a livery cellar. It ruins the knees. Cole didn't touch the cup offered to him. He kept his hands behind his back, his fingers tucked into his belt. "The cell is dry enough, Judge. The cell is a temporary necessity," Thaddeus said, taking a slow sip. "Like the town itself. We build the walls out of cedar posts and mud because that's what we have. But eventually, Cole, a man wants to see a stone foundation under his house. He wants to know the roof won't blow off when the blue norther comes down." He leaned back, his spectacles hanging from a black ribbon around his neck. He looked at Cole with the quiet affection of an old employer. "Abigail spent the night in the archive basement," Thaddeus said. "It wasn't a question. She is an efficient clerk," Cole replied. "The circuit doesn't pay them to sleep." Thaddeus laughed, a short, pleasant sound that didn't disturb the gold chain on his chest. "She's a Vance, Cole. She has that narrow, northern look about the eyes. My brother Elias had it too. They look at a ledger, and they think the whole world can be divided into 2 columns, what S owed and what S paid. They don't see the weather. They don't see the grass." He stood up, walking over to the small iron safe that sat in the corner of the room behind a green velvet curtain. He didn't touch the dial. He just rested his hand on the black iron top. "I knew her name was on the schedule 3 weeks ago," Thaddeus said softly. Cole shifted his boots on the rug. The leather groaned. "You could have told the district office to send a different recorder." "Why?" Thaddeus turned his head, his blue eyes sharp behind his silver brows. "A variable isn't something you run away from." "Marshal," Thaddeus said, his words falling into that slow, rhythmic cadence of the bench. "A variable is something you bring into the room where you can watch the needle move. Abigail needed to come to Pale Fork. She has spent 9 years carrying her father's ghost around the East like a piece of dry meat in a sack. I wanted her to see what Elias couldn't understand. I wanted her to see the town." He walked back to the desk, his hand coming down on a leather-bound book with a green oilskin cover. It wasn't hidden. It sat right beside his coffee cup. "Jesse Pruitt doesn't know how to read a land description," Thaddeus said, his fingers tapping the green cover. "Tack. Tack. A human being has a right to know where his fence line sits, Thaddeus," Cole said. His voice was low, coming from the gray stubble of his jaw like stone grinding on sand. "That's what the Federal Survey is for. If a man buys 5 acres from the state, he has a right to find those 5 acres in the dirt, exactly where the book says they are. You can't just slide the line 3 miles east because the railroad wants the creek." Thaddeus picked up the green ledger. and held it out between them. He didn't look angry. He looked like a schoolmaster explaining the globe to a boy who had never seen the sea. "The railroad brings the stone for the bank, Cole," Thaddeus said. His voice didn't rise. It grew heavier. "The railroad brings the seed wheat for the German farmers on the ridge. If the line doesn't go through the creek timber, the company loops 20 miles south around the county line, and Pale Fork turns back into a buffalo wallow by Christmas." Elias wanted to file a protest because 3 Mexican sheep herders didn't have their names on the original patents. He wanted to kill the town to save the paperwork. He laid the book back down on the mahogany desk with a hollow thump. "A judge doesn't just try cases, Marshal," Thaddeus said. "He decides what the piece is worth." Elias Vance was too expensive for Texas, so I sent him away, and I signed his name to the ledger because the county needed to see that the clerk had approved the transition. A town needs to believe in its own foundation, Cole, even if the stones were stolen from the creek. Cole looked at the green ledger. He could see his own reflection in the polished wood of the desk, a gray man with a tin star and a rifle he hadn't fired in 3 years. "Jess Pruitt didn't steal that book," Cole said. "He knows it exists," Thaddeus replied, walking toward his wardrobe to reach for his silk robe. "And in a county like this, Cole, knowing a thing exists is just as dangerous as holding the knife. Tell the jury to bring in the verdict by noon. Abigail will record it. She write her name under my signature on the warrant, and then she go back to Austin on the Friday coach." He pulled the black silk over his shoulders, the fabric rustling like dry grass in the wind. "And if she doesn't?" Cole asked. Thaddeus adjusted his collar before the glass mirror on the door. "Then she ceases to be a clerk, Cole, and she becomes another variable." The lamp in Abby Vance's boarding house room did not have a chimney glass. The wick was bare, the yellow flame twisting and smoking every time the cold wind found the cracks in the cedar siding. Abby sat on the edge of the shuck mattress, her gray wool skirt pulled tight around her shins. Her steno box sat open on the washstand, the white paper ribbon hanging down into the porcelain bowl like a piece of dead skin. She had her father's iron-rimmed spectacles in her lap. She wasn't wearing them. She was just holding the wire frames between her thumbs until the metal bent under the pressure. It was past midnight. The town was quiet, except for the steady, rhythmic thump-thump of the steam pump at the railway tank a mile down the track. The door didn't shake when Cole Sterling knocked. He used the flat of his leather glove, 3 short strikes that sounded like a horse kicking the side of a stall. Abby didn't ask who it was. She stood up, her boots making a dull sound on the rag rug, and pulled the iron bolt back from the cedar casing. Cole stood in the hall. He looked bigger in the dark. His wool coat, wet with the night, missed his Stetson, pulled low until his eyes were just 2 dark circles beneath the brim. He didn't have his rifle. He had a piece of yellow foolscap paper folded into his vest pocket. "He is 12 miles out," Cole said. He didn't step into the room. He stayed in the gray shadow of the hallway. Abby's fingers stopped moving against the wire frames of the spectacles. "The line shack. The old line shack by the dry fork of the Sabine," Cole said. His voice was lower than usual, muffled by the damp wool of his collar. "The judge pays a hand named Gidley $10 a month to haul a sack of cornmeal and a side of salt pork out there every first Tuesday. He's been doing it since the winter of '72. Abby looked down at the paper ribbon in her washstand bowl. He stayed. He stayed because he couldn't leave," Cole said. He stepped over the threshold then, his boots leaving 2 dark, wet ovals of grease on the clean pine floor. He took the yellow paper from his vest and laid it flat on her small writing desk beside the lamp. "That's the letter he gave me 3 years ago," Cole said. "The day I found him out there while I was tracking those horse thieves from the territory. Read it, Miss Vance. You have more right to the words than I ever did." Abby walked to the desk. Her hand didn't shake as she took the yellow sheet. The ink was different from the state ink. It was dark blue, thin, written with a homemade quill made from a wild turkey feather. She recognized the tilt of the letters. The numbers were written in that old Philadelphia style. The fours closed at the top, like little boxes. "Cole," the letter read. "If the girl asks, tell her the state took the books. Tell her I died in the salt marsh below Houston. A man who cannot sit at his bench without a guard behind him is no father to a woman who has to earn her bread by her pen. Do not let her see what Thaddeus made of me. Let her keep the name clean." Abby read it twice. She didn't cry. Her face stayed as steady and plain as it had been on the stagecoach from Austin. She folded the yellow paper back into its creases and laid it down beside the iron frames. "He chose the shack," she said. Her voice was flat, rhythmic. "He chose the shame," Cole replied, leaning his shoulder against the rough timber of the window frame. "That is the part the lawyers don't put into the statutes." "Miss Vance," Cole said, his words coming with those long, deliberate gaps where the wind filled the room. "A man can survive a bullet in the thigh or a winter without meat. But when you take his work away, when you tell him, his hand doesn't have the right to sign the record he spent his whole life keeping you break something inside the bone that the doctor can't reach." Elias didn't stay out there because Thaddeus had a lock on the door. He stayed because he couldn't look into a glass mirror and find the clerk he used to be. He let the judge erase him because he had already erased himself. Abby turned her back to the lamp, her gray dress catching the shadow of the bedpost until she looked like a drawing made with charcoal. "My father was wrong, Marshall," she said, her voice rising until it was the loudest thing in the room, though she didn't shout. "And you were wrong to give him the shovel to dig that hole. A human being doesn't lose his right to his life just because his work gets broken." Elias Vance wasn't just a clerk. He was a citizen of the United States, and he had a right to stand in the light of the sun, even if his hands were shaking and his inkstone was dry. When you let Thaddeus hide him to save his pride, you weren't protecting his name. You were just helping the judge bury the evidence of his own crime. A man's dignity isn't a secret you keep in a line shack, Cole Sterling. It's a right he has to claim before the world. Cole looked at his hands. The leather gloves were stained with the oil from his Winchester barrel. "The judge has the jury in his pocket, Abby," Cole said. It was the first time he had used her name without the title. It sounded strange in the room, like a new coin dropped on an old floor. "They'll hang Jesse tomorrow at 3. If we go out to that shack, we won't be back until the wagon is already at the cemetery." Abby walked to the washstand and took her steno box by the leather handle. She closed the lid with a sharp, brass click that sounded like a pistol, cocking in the quiet. "Then we don't go to the shack first," she said. She walked past him to the door, her gray wool shawl thrown over her shoulder like an officer's cape. She didn't look back at the letter or the spectacles on the desk. "We go to the courthouse," Abby said, her boots already clicking on the hall stairs. "Because before Thaddeus Vance can call that jury to order, I'm going to open the big ledger on the bench, and I'm going to write the name of Elias Vance into the day's docket as the first witness for the defense." Cole Sterling stood in the empty room for 5 seconds while the bare wick smoked against the wall. Then he reached down, took his badge off the writing desk where he had left it, and pinned it flat against his wool coat. He didn't use the sliding scale anymore. The silver point went straight through the wool until it hit the bone beneath his ribs. The dawn that came over Pale Fork did not bring the sun. It brought a low, heavy wall of slate-colored fog that rolled up from the bottomlands of the Sabine, smelling of wet cedar and rotted leaves. Cole Sterling stood alone in the marshal's office. The stove was still cold. He hadn't built a fire because the wood felt too heavy in his arms. He stood by his desk, looking at the small rectangular mirror that hung from a rusty nail beside the gun rack. It was cheap glass, full of bubbles and green streaks that distorted a man's face if he didn't stand exactly in the center. He looked at his own reflection. He saw the gray in his mustache. He saw the deep, vertical split in his lower lip where a mule had kicked him 12 years ago in El Paso. Then he looked at the open door of Judge Thaddeus Vance's office across the hallway. The judge was already there. He was standing before his own glass mirror, a tall, walnut-framed plate that had come from France. Thaddeus was brushing a speck of lint from the lapel of his black broadcloth coat, his hand moving with the smooth, circular rhythm of a man who had never had to hurry a horse or wait out a blizzard in a hole in the dirt. Cole looked from his own rough skin to the judge's smooth silver beard. For 9 years, he had told himself they were different men. He had told himself the judge was the master, and he was just the hand that held the key. But looking through the green streaks of the cheap mirror, the distance between the badge and the gavel didn't look like 12 yards of hallway anymore. It looked like the thickness of a leaf. The latch on the rear window rattled. Cole didn't look around. He knew the gate. Abby Vance came through the back door, her boots carrying no more dust than the fog itself. She had her canvas satchel gripped under her arm, her fingers white where they pressed against the heavy sailcloth. Her gray dress was damp at the hem, the wet wool smelling of the prairie grass. She stood by the cold stove, her eyes fixing on Cole's face in the glass. "You're looking at the wrong man, Marshal," she said. Her voice was thin, dry, even as the fog outside. Cole let his hand drop to his belt. He didn't turn around. A man 41 years old ought to know what he looks like before he goes into a courtroom, Miss Vance. You look like a deputy who stayed in the shade until his star turned dark, Abby said. She walked over to the desk, her satchel coming down with a soft, hollow thud against the pine boards. "That is what my father didn't put into his shorthand books," she said, her voice dropping into that conversational cadence that cut through the yellow light of the lamp. "The law doesn't fail because the bad men are too strong, Cole Sterling. It fails because the decent men decide that a little bit of grease on the wheel is better than a squeak in the night. You looked at Thaddeus for 9 years, and you told yourself you were keeping the peace. But you weren't. You were just buying your own comfort with Jesse Pruitt's skin. When you look in that glass, you aren't seeing a marshal. You're seeing the judge shadow with a gun on its hip." Cole turned slowly. His boots didn't scrape. They were too wet for that. He looked at her tight, dark bun, the absolute lack of ornament on her collar, and the iron-shod steno box she held against her ribs. "A shadow doesn't open the door, Abby," Cole said. His words came with those long, heavy gaps where his breath showed gray in the cold room. "A shadow stays behind the chair. I didn't take Thaddeus's money. I didn't buy none of that land on the creek. A man has a right to be judged by what he took out of the drawer, not just what he didn't put back in. I kept the boys from burning the camp. That's what the state paid me for." Abby reached into her satchel and pulled out the yellow letter Elias Vance had written from the line shack. She didn't hand it to him. She laid it flat on the desk, right over the county survey map. An omission is just a forgery written in air, Marshal, Abby said, her gray eyes locking onto his silver star. When a man with a badge sees a crime and calls it the price of the peace, he isn't a peace officer anymore. He is just an appraiser for the thief. A human being has an absolute right to be protected from the silence of the state. Jesse Pruitt didn't just lose his liberty when they put him in that cellar. He lost the protection of every man who ever swore an oath in this county. If you don't use that star today, you might as well take it down to the blacksmith and have him melt it into an anvil. Cole reached out and took the yellow paper. His thumb left a gray smudge of oil on the margin. He looked across the hall at Thaddeus, who was now lifting his silk judicial robe over his shoulders, his arms spreading wide like an eagle, preparing to drop from the timber. The grand jury clerk in Austin won't have this docket before Tuesday, Cole said. The docket is right here, Abby said, tapping her steno box. The state doesn't live in Austin, Marshal. It lives in the ink. Let's go across the hall and see if the judge knows how to read his brother's hand. Cole didn't answer. He walked to the gun rack, took down his Winchester, and worked the lever once. The brass cartridge slid into the chamber with a clean metallic snap that ended the conversation. He didn't put the gun on his shoulder. He carried it in his left hand, down by his knee, the way a man carries an axe when he's going into the brush to find a stray. The clock in the steeple of the Pale Fork Methodist Church did not strike 9. The dampness from the river fog had swollen the cedar gears in the tower, locking the hammer against the bell until it produced only a dull, iron groan that died before it reached the square. But the courtroom was full anyway. The men from the line camps sat on the cedar benches, their wool coats steaming in the close heat of the room. They didn't talk. They didn't trade tobacco. They sat with their hats between their knees, their eyes moving from the empty jury box to the high mahogany bench, where Thaddeus Vance sat with his gold spectacles perched on his nose. Abby Vance was already at her desk below the rail. Her steno machine was balanced on her knees, the white paper ribbon feeding into the zinc bowl she had brought from the boarding house. Her fingers were still. They looked like 10 pieces of dry willow wood frozen above the keys. Jesse Pruitt was brought in at 5 minutes past the hour. He didn't have his boots on. They had taken his leather shoes to keep him from kicking the cell bars, so he walked in his gray wool socks, his feet leaving 2 damp trails of grease on the sawdust floor. He sat in the defense chair, his shoulders hunched, until his chin touched the collar of his canvas shirt. Thaddeus picked up his cedar gavel. He didn't strike the block. He just held the handle between his thumb and forefinger, using the heavy head to point at the jury box. "Gentlemen," Thaddeus said. His baritone was clear, beautiful, unaffected by the damp. "The arguments have been concluded. The evidence of the state is material and uncontradicted. The law does not require us to spend the county S oil on an empty debate. You will retire to the Clerk S office and return with the endorsement of the Court S finding." Miller, the defense attorney, didn't stand up. He was looking at his fingernails, his linen collar yellow with sweat. The foreman of the jury, a cattle buyer named Horn, with an iron watch chain across his vest, stood up to lead the 12 men toward the side door. "Hold the horses, Silas," a voice said from the back. Cole Sterling stepped through the double doors. He didn't have his Stetson on. He stood in the entryway, his iron-gray hair damp from the fog. His Winchester rifle held flat against his thigh. He didn't look at the jury. He looked straight up at the high bench, his boots finding the exact center of the main aisle. Thaddeus Vance slowly lowered his spectacles. His silver eyebrows came together until they formed a single hard line across his forehead. "Marshal Sterling," Thaddeus said, his voice dropping an octave into that cold territorial iron. "You are out of order. The jury is retiring to consider the verdict. Take your post at the door." Cole walked down the aisle. He didn't hurry. His boots made a rhythmic, heavy thump-thump on the pine boards that matched the steam pump outside. He stopped at the cedar rail, right behind Abby's desk. "I have a federal warrant, Judge," Cole said. He reached into his coat with his right hand and pulled out a blue paper sheet with the seal of the United States District Court at Austin. He didn't hand it to the bailiff. He laid it flat on the railing before Abby's machine. "This is a writ of habeas corpus," Cole said, his words coming slow, separated by those long, quiet pauses that made the whole room hold its breath. "S, signed by Judge Duvall at Austin on the 14th of October, Cole said, looking Thaddeus straight in the eye. "It says the United States Marshal has the authority to halt any proceeding in a county court if there is a material witness being held without a name within the jurisdiction. I am opening a federal inquiry into the disappearance of Sir Clerk Elias Vance in the year 1872, and I'm calling Jesse Pruitt as the first witness to state what he saw on the night of September 28th of that year." Thaddeus stood up. His silk robe flew back from his shoulders like the wings of a crow. He struck the cedar block with his gavel 3 times, the sound loud as pistol shots in the small room. "This is an outrage." "Sterling," Thaddeus roared, "you have no standing to introduce a separate docket into a capital murder case. The prisoner is being tried for the death of Samuel Hogue, not for some ancient piece of town gossip." Abby's fingers began to move. Clack, clack, thump. She didn't look at her uncle. She didn't look at Cole. Her eyes were fixed on the zinc bowl as the paper ribbon began to pile up like white ribbon. "Let her write, Thaddeus," Cole said quietly. He leaned his Winchester against the cedar rail, his hand never leaving the stock. "That is the second lesson of the federal court, Judge," Cole said, his voice dropping into that quiet, conversational gravel that reached every man on the benches. "A county court is just a room with some cedar siding until the record is made. If the record is rotten, the room doesn't have any authority at all. The United States government doesn't care about your piece, Thaddeus. It cares about the names in the book. A man has a right to be heard before his neck is measured, whether he's a Vance or a Pruitt or a vagrant from the camps. Read the letter, Abby." Abby stood up from her bench. She didn't use her shorthand book. She held the blue federal sheet in her left hand and the yellow Turkish ink letter in her right. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had that steady, plain rhythm that didn't have a single shake in it. "This is the deposition of Jesse Pruitt, taken under oath in the county jail on the 22nd of October. Abby read. "He states that on the night Elias Vance disappeared, he observed 2 men named Horn and Gidley, acting under the verbal instruction of Judge Thaddeus Vance, enter the clerk's room at the hotel. He saw them remove 3 pages of the county survey ledger, the pages defining the water rights of the Sabine Creek, and substitute a forged signature on the personnel record. He states he saw them escort Likelak's Vance into its closed carriage while the deputy marshal looked the other way. The courtroom became so quiet that the dripping of the fog from the eaves outside sounded like a clock ticking. Silas Horn, the jury foreman, looked at the judge. His red face had turned the color of old lard. He didn't look back at the jury room door. Thaddeus Vance didn't strike his gavel again. He sat down slowly in his leather chair, his silk robe folding under him until he looked smaller than he had at 9 o'clock. He looked at his niece, at her gray wool dress, her ink-stained fingers, and the steady, plain face that didn't show a single sign of his own blood. "You're destroying the county, Abigail," Thaddeus said, softly across the rail. "There won't be a bank in this valley by Monday morning." "The bank doesn't own the name, Uncle," Abby said. She sat down again at her desk, her hands returning to the bone keys of her machine. "A town can survive without a brick bank," she said, her fingers starting their light, rhythmic taps. "It can even survive without a railroad tank. But it can't survive if the people inside the houses have to lie to their children about who owns the dirt under the floor. The record is open now, Thaddeus. And the record doesn't close until every man who ever signed a lie has his name written down in the column where it belongs." She struck the spacebar twice, 2 blank lines. A space for the federal judge to sign when the coach came in from Austin on Friday afternoon. Cole Sterling took his rifle from the rail and turned his face toward the double doors at the back. He didn't look back at the judge's mirror or the gold watch chain. He looked at Jesse Pruitt, whose head had finally come up from his collar, his eyes looking at the gray fog outside like he could see the grass growing through the mist. "The coach comes at 5, Cole said. "I'll have the transcript ready by 4, Abby said. Her fingers didn't stop. Clack, clack, thump. The paper ribbon kept coming, clean and white, recording the first true words Pale Fork had heard in 9 long years. The red dust of Pale Fork did not blow that November. It settled into the frozen ruts of the stage road and stayed there like iron filings. By the following autumn, the population of the valley stood at 419. If a man took the trouble to count Elias Vance, whose name had finally been restored to the county tax roll in a clean, round hand that didn't look like Thaddeus' script. The town looked the same from the ridge. The church steeple still had that tilt to the west where the cedar timbers had dried unevenly. The horses still gathered around the big cottonwood by the livery stable to get out of the noon heat. But there was a new rule in the county. It wasn't written on the pine board outside the sheriff's office, and it wasn't printed in the Austin paper. It was just something the cattle hands knew when they came across the rail to settle their accounts. Every word spoken before the bench stayed in the book. There were no razor cuts in the binding. Abigail Vance sat at her small oak desk in the corner of the courtroom, her gray wool skirt spread flat around the iron legs of her chair. The room smelled of cold tallow and dry paper, the standard smell of a public office when the sun hits the pine shingles after a hard frost. Her steno machine sat before her, the brass rollers polished until they reflected the blue of the sky outside the tall glass windows. She wasn't tapping the keys. Her hands were folded in her lap, her fingers resting against each other like the ribs of an old basket. To her right, the heavy cedar gate opened with a short, familiar click. Elias Vance walked in. He didn't wear his black broadcloth coat from Philadelphia anymore. He wore a heavy canvas jacket with bone buttons and a pair of blue denim trousers that had been reinforced at the knees with patches of deer hide. He carried a small slate board under his arm and 3 cedar pencils tied together with a piece of butcher's twine. His hair was white as a river stone now, but his eyes were clear behind his round, iron-rimmed spectacles. He didn't look at the high bench where his brother Thaddeus used to sit. He looked at the low oak desk where Abby sat. "The German boy from the ridge is outside, Abby," Elias said. His voice was lower than it used to be, rough from the 9 years of wood smoke in the eastern line shack, but it had that same precise, rhythmic cadence. "He wants to know if the land description on his homestead patent includes the timber by the spring. He can read the surveyor as chain marks on the parchment. Abby stood up, her dress falling straight without a sound. She reached into her drawer and pulled out the green oilskin ledger, the one Cole Sterling had taken from Thaddeus, safe, before the federal judge arrived from Austin. Tell him to bring his father's receipt, Father, Abby said. She laid the green book flat on the railing between them, her thumb smoothing down the corner of the cover. That is what we have to teach them before the winter sets in, Elias said, his fingers tapping the slate board under his arm. Tack. Tack. A piece of land isn't just grass and water, Abby. It's an entry in a public book. If a man doesn't know how to read the description, if he doesn't know what a link or a rod means in the language of the state, he doesn't really own his farm. He just occupies it until someone with a louder voice comes along with a different piece of paper. The literacy of the law is the only shield a poor man has against the landlord. Abby opened the green ledger to the page dated September 28, 1872. Her father's signature was there now, written in his true hand, the capital V, starting from the blunt hook at the bottom, where his left hand had rebelled against the right-handed pen. Beneath it, the federal court had stamped its blue seal, verified and certified, November 12, 1878. Jesse Pruitt has his first 5 head of cattle on the lower lease, Abby said, her eyes moving to the window that looked out toward the square. I saw him at the blacksmith's this morning, Elias said. He reached out and touched the verified signature with his index finger, his old hand steady against the yellowed paper. Jesse understands the contract now, Elias said, his voice dropping into that quiet conversational gravel that filled the empty courtroom. He knows that a man's labor isn't something he sells for whatever coins are left in the rancher's pocket at the end of the season. A fair wage is a matter of public right, and the agreement must be logged in the county book just like a deed or a marriage certificate. When a man has his contract written down in the record, he isn't a servant anymore, Abby. He's a partner in the territory. That's what Thaddeus wanted to destroy, the idea that a common hand could hold the judge to his word. He turned back toward the door, his deer hide patches rustling against the pine benches as he walked out to meet the German boy on the steps. He was going to teach him his letters using the land laws of the state of Texas. It was a slow way to build a school, but Elias Vance had always been a patient man with an inkstone. The sun was dropping below the roof of the livery stable when Cole Sterling stepped through the front doors of the courthouse. He didn't have his Winchester rifle in his hand. He carried a bucket of fresh well water for the office stove and a small sack of parched corn from the dry goods store. His 5-pointed silver star was pinned flat against his faded wool coat, right where the bone met the muscle over his heart. The badge didn't look dark anymore. He had rubbed it with wood ashes until the edges were silver again. He stopped at the low wooden rail that separated the public benches from the clerk's desk. He didn't step inside the gate. He stood in the entryway, his hat held between his thumbs, looking at the white paper ribbon that hung from Abby Essen's machine. The stagecoach from Red Rock is late, Cole said. The driver said, the creek is up at the lower crossing. The circuit doesn't change for the water, Marshal, Abby said, without looking up. She was using a small steel file to clean the typefaces on the iron keys of her machine. Small, rhythmic scrapes. Scritch. The dockets for the December session arrived by mail rider yesterday. There are 11 land disputes and a branding case from the Western Line. Cole looked at the empty judge's chair. A man named Miller, not the young attorney who had lost his nerve, but an older cousin from San Antonio, was coming to take the bench on Monday. He wasn't a Vance. He didn't have a gold watch chain or 3 portraits on the wall. He just had a leather bag full of precedents and an old horse that didn't like the mud. "The town is quiet," Cole said. "A town is never quiet, Cole," Abby said, using her rag to wipe the steel oil from the levers. "It's just waiting to see who writes the next entry," she said, her voice carrying that steady, plain rhythm that had become the clock of the courthouse. When you have a court where every man's name is written down in the same ink, where the sheep herder's testimony has the same weight on the page as the judge's signature, the piece isn't something you have to guard with a Winchester rifle. The piece is just the baseline of the ledger. A community doesn't stay together because you build a fence around the camp, Marshal. It stays together because every man inside the camp knows his rights are being logged by an honest hand. Cole looked down at his boots. The leather was old, but the grease was fresh. "I stayed because of the book, Abby," he said softly. "I know," she replied. She stood up from her chair, her gray dress falling straight and plain around her ankles. She walked to the railing where he stood, her hand resting on the smooth oak wood, right above the spot where the old clerk's bench had been joined to the floor. She didn't offer her hand to be held. They were people past 40. They didn't need the lace or the promises of the parlor songs. But she didn't look past him either. Her gray eyes were wide, clear, reflecting the yellow light of the lantern he had left burning in the office across the hall. "The county needs a permanent recorder, Cole," she said. "The circuit is too long for a woman who wants to keep her inkstone in one place." Cole lifted his chin, his stone-colored eyes fixing on her face. "The county doesn't have the budget for a full-time salary, Abby." "Then I'll take my pay in the timberland by the dry fork," she said, her lips tightening into the ghost of a smile that didn't change the steadiness of her jaw. The 3 acres Thaddeus forgot to put into his private book. "I think my father would like to see some corn growing in that red dirt." Cole reached up and touched the brim of his Stetson, his leather glove rough against the felt. "I'll tell the surveyor to bring his chains tomorrow morning. We'll map the line from the big cottonwood to the creek bed." "Make sure he uses the federal marks," Abby said. "I don't want any sliding scales in the descriptions." "The marks are stone, Abby," Cole said. "They don't move." An hour later, the courthouse was dark. The wind from the north had cleared the fog away, leaving the Texas sky vast, cold, and crowded with stars that looked like small points of silver, pinned flat against the black wool of the night. Down in the square, Bertie Cross was sitting on the horse trough behind the blacksmith's shop, a piece of slate in her lap and a cedar pencil between her fingers, spelling out the word Habea by the light of the stable lamp. She didn't look like an orphan who needed to be saved. She looked like an appraiser, checking the weight of the gold. Inside the courtroom, Abby Vance sat down at her bench last time before she turned the wick down on the lamp. She didn't open the official docket. She opened her private leather-bound book with the brass clasp. On the final page, beneath the notes on the Pruitt trial and the description of the green oilskin ledger, she wrote 3 short lines in her neat, unhurried shorthand. "Pale Fork, Texas, November 23, 1879. The record is complete. Jesse Pruitt is on his land. Elias Vance is at his desk. The marshal is at the door. 4. We have written the names where the state can see them, and, for the first time in 9 years, the valley does not have to look at the glass to find its face." She closed the clasp with a clean metallic click that sounded like the latch of a gate sliding into place. She didn't look at the portraits on the wall. She didn't look at the empty gallery. She stood up, took her steno box by the leather handle, and walked down the main aisle toward the front doors, where Cole Sterling was waiting with his horse in the red dust. They had described her as steady and plain. But as she stepped through the door into the cold night air, her hand resting on the iron latch of the courthouse, Cole looked at her from his saddle and knew that the woman who had written the truth into the marrow of a broken town would never be plain. She was the ledger itself, and the ledger was finally clean. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.
Not because a gun was fired, though Cole Sterling had one. Not because a cavalry rode in from Austin, though the federal writ arrived. The ledger was clean because a woman in a plain gray dress sat down at a pine desk, placed her fingers on iron keys, and refused to stop writing. That is the whole story, distilled to its core. Abigail Vance did not arrive in Pale Fork as a hero. She arrived as a clerk. And it turned out that in a town where the judge had spent 9 years deciding which words were allowed to exist, a clerk with an honest hand was the most dangerous thing alive. This story is, at its foundation, about a question that every society in every era has had to answer. Who owns the record? Because whoever owns the record owns the truth, and whoever owns the truth owns the past, and whoever owns the past owns the future of every man, woman, and orphaned girl who lives within riding distance of the courthouse. Thaddeus Vance understood this with the cold, architectural precision of a man who had spent a lifetime building rooms out of other people's silence. He didn't steal land with a gun. He stole it with a razor and a ledger, cutting 3 pages from the binding, forging a signature on a departure form, and counting on the fact that a town too frightened to look up at the sky would never think to look down at the fine print. He turned the machinery of justice into a machine for injustice, and he ran it smoothly, and he called it peace. But Abigail understood something her uncle never could, because understanding it required something he lacked entirely: the willingness to be nobody, to be plain, to sit in the corner of the courtroom and listen so carefully that you hear not just the words but the silence between them, the 3-second pause before a witness answers, the double blank space where a judge cuts off a question that was getting too close to the truth. Power announces itself. Justice records. And the record, once set down in clean iron ink on honest paper, belongs to everyone. It cannot be unfired like a bullet. It cannot be unspoken like a verdict. It stays. And staying is its entire purpose. Cole Sterling's story runs alongside Abby's like a shadow alongside a lamp, and it illuminates something the story does not flinch from. Cole was not a villain. He was a deputy at 32 with new boots and a belief that keeping people alive was the same thing as keeping them free. It wasn't. He looked at the peace of Pale Fork, the church steeple, the schoolhouse, the families sleeping without rifle fire outside their windows, and he told himself that Elias Vance was one man, and the town was 300, and the arithmetic was simple. But the arithmetic was wrong. Because when you allow a lie to stand in the public record for the sake of comfort, you don't protect 300 people. You teach 300 people that their names are also negotiable, that their deeds are also provisional, that their lives also exist at the pleasure of the man with the gavel. Cole didn't save the town from chaos. He saved Thaddeus Vance from consequences. There is a difference. And Abby names it without mercy. An omission is just a forgery written in air. And then there is Elias, the father in the line shack, who chose the shame of invisibility over the indignity of being seen broken. His story breaks the heart twice, once for what was done to him, and once for what he did to himself. Because Thaddeus Vance stripped him of his name and his desk and his legal existence, and Elias, in response, finished the job. He decided that a man without his inkstone was not a man worth finding, and he asked Cole to let his daughter grieve a ghost rather than look at the living ruin. It is the same instinct that runs through every story in this frontier world, that ancient, terrible conviction that love means protecting someone from the truth, that the kindest thing a broken man can do is stay broken quietly, where no one has to look at him. Abby answers it the same way she answers everything, by writing it down. A human being does not lose his right to stand in the light because his work was taken from him. Dignity is not a credential. It is not something issued with the job and revoked when the job is gone. It is the irreducible fact of a person's existence. And no one, not a corrupt judge, not a frightened deputy, not even a loving father's shame, has the authority to file it away in a line shack and call that mercy. What Pale Fork becomes, in the end, is not a perfect town. The church steeple still tilts, the stage road still floods at the lower crossing. But every word spoken before the bench stays in the book. There are no razor cuts in the binding. Jesse Pruitt knows where his fence line sits. The German boy on the ridge can bring his father's receipt and have someone read it to him without fear. Bertie Cross sits by the stable lamp spelling out the word habeas by cedar pencil light, and she does not look like a girl who needs saving. She looks like an appraiser checking the weight of gold. That is the legacy of a woman described as steady and plain. "Plain things," she told the marshal on the day she stepped off the stagecoach, "do not warp in the sun." She was right. The ornate things, the walnut bench, the silk robe, the gold watch chain, the beautiful baritone voice that filled the rafters like a church bell, all of it warped. All of it cracked under the weight of what it was hiding. But the plain gray dress sat at the plain oak desk and kept writing. And the writing outlasted the empire, and the empire fell, and the valley found its face. The ledger is the law, and the law, when held in an honest hand, belongs to everyone.